Hi folks, hope you're well. So this should mark the final video, I think, of the series on love and marriage for the EDUQAS Latin GCSE. We're going to have a look at Pliny. So it is the final prose author. Everything in red, remember, is prose. Everything in pink is poetry. So the effects we look for are going to be a little bit different. We're not going to be looking at metre or end-line emphasis or anything like that. So we've seen Pliny already when we were looking at his marriage to Calpurnia. And in his letter about his wife Calpurnia, it's to Calpurnia's aunt, and it's about Calpurnia. He talks about how great his new wife is, basically, because she's so faithful to him. She takes an interest in everything he's interested in. She takes an interest in his career. And in this letter, Pliny's writing to a friend who's also a senator about like an anecdote, really, of a woman who dies for her husband. So it's really making the point that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, and it's like a bit of local inside knowledge. But again, it's kind of harping on the theme we've seen of the way that wives were expected to be and the way that they were expected to behave in a marriage and the kind of loyalty that Roman men really prized in a wife. So if you think about where we started with Epitaph to Claudia, this is the sort of thing that Roman women were praised for. Not necessarily always dying with their husbands, but being very loyal, caring wives who stand by their husband in all things. And we'll kind of see that theme coming up again here. So we'll look at the Latin, we'll look at the English, and then we'll start to look for some effects you could talk about in the exam. So, navigabam per larium nostrum, cum amicus ostendit mihi villam atque etiam cubiculum, quod in lacum prominet. Ex hoc inquit, olim femina quaedam cum maritos e praecipitavit. Maritus ex diutino morbo ulceribus putrescebat. That wasn't for dramatic effect, I just tripped over on the Latin. So, navigabam, I was sailing. Know that from the language paper. Larium nostrum is our Larius, so here it's like a bit of shared knowledge with his friend. So it's a lake, but it's their local one. Cum amicus, when a friend, ostendit, showed or pointed out. Where do you know from the language paper? Villam, a house, mihi, to me. Etiam, even the cubiculum, the bedroom. Prominent, which is kind of standing out, it's prominent, in lacum, over the lake. So the vocab's not too tricky, actually. Olim, once, femina, a woman. And here, praecipitavit, hurled herself. So the English word we get from this is a precipice. A precipice is something that you would kind of fall off. Cum marito, with her husband. Maritus, husband again. So you've got quite a few words that you do know. The words that you wouldn't know, diutino morbo, lengthy illness. Illness like morbo is where we get morbid or morbidly. Ulceribus, with ulcers. Putrescebat, was wasting away. I think we get putrefy probably from putrescebat. It's grim. He's not in a good way. So, uxor ut corpus inspiceret exegit. Neque enim quemquam fidelius indicatorum non posset sanari. Vidit desperavit, hortata est ut moreretur. Comesque ipsa mortis, dux imo et exemplum, et necessitas fuit. Namse cum marito ligavit, abiecitque in lacum. So, uxor, his wife, exegit, insisted. I think it's ex plus ago, but it's not one on the language paper. Inspicere, not on the language paper, I don't think, but really similar to inspected. Corpus, body, from the language paper. Vidit, she looked. Desperavit, she despaired. Words from the language paper. Hortata est, she encouraged him. We know that she did it because this is it's perfect passive inform, but it's deponent. Hortor, I encourage, is a deponent verb. Looks passive, always active. So if you look on the participle, hortata, it's describing the wife. She encouraged him. Ut moreretur, in order that he might die. So we've got ut plus subjunctive. So we've got an indirect command, I guess, here in the use of the subjunctive. Comes, companion, mortis, in death. Word you know from the language paper. Dux, leader. Fuit, this is was. You're used to seeing it as erat. Fuit is the perfect tense of the verb to be, and you don't see it very often. So if we look, where does it come up? She was an example and a compulsion. So she was an example and compulsion. The reason we have fuit and not erat is because it's not a continuous state. This was something she did instantly because, as we're going to find out now, Abiekit, she threw herself out of the window in lacum into the lake. So, she was a necessity and an instruction very, very quickly, instantaneously. And that's why we've got this unusual form of to be, fuit, in the perfect tense. So, grammar and vocab we know. Let's have a look at effects. This seems to be quite a wealthy couple. Like, they live on the lake. They're not named as part of high society. It's quite anecdotal because here we have some dialogue. Like, we have Pliny's friend telling him this story, so it's like a bit of an urban legend. We have marito and maritus to emphasise their relationship, so they're always like referred to as husband and wife. No one knows their names. But here, like Femina, she's the protagonist, so she's the woman with her husband. She's not actually called a wife until later on when she takes on a more active role. So probably not intentionally, the emphasis is on the husband. Putresceba, this is a really vivid verb. He was putrefying with ulcers. So it's like, it's not enough to just say he's dying. He's dying in a really gruesome and off-putting and repulsive way. But actually, that becomes important to the second part of this story. Uxor, the wife, insists exegit inspiceret on inspecting him. So there's a few things going on here. Like, it emphasises, in the comments by EDUQAS, they've said it emphasises that this kind of intimacy is unusual, and perhaps a Roman wife wouldn't see her husband naked that often. Okay, maybe. The other thing is, if he's covered in ulcers, it's not a nice job. Like, she's going to great lengths and extremes to look after him by inspecting his body, which is covered in these disgusting ulcers, which are potentially contagious. So, yes, it's emphasising the unusual intimacy, and that could be because of the relationship that married couples had, but it could also be because he is repulsive. And it goes back to something Pliny said in his letter to his wife's aunt. He says, I know my wife doesn't love me because of my body and because of the way that I look, but actually that will make our marriage stronger. She loves me for me. And we see a similar emphasis on what Pliny's saying here. Like, this husband is repulsively covered in ulcers and his wife wants to inspect his body anyway. So you could draw a nice parallel with what Pliny says elsewhere, that love isn't about just desire, it's about care and intimacy for the other person. And we see that built on here. So fidelius is like more loyal or more honest. She says no one's going to be more honest about your condition. One of the cultural notes that comes up in EDUQAS's notes here is that sometimes doctors would take advantage of patients they knew to be terminal because they knew they were desperate and they knew that they couldn't take their money with them. So there does seem to be a bit of a reluctance to involve doctors who could take advantage of the situation. But the idea of loyalty, fidelius, is kind of a key term. We see it when we look at the tombstones, which we'll look at in a moment. We see it when Pliny talks about his wife in his other letter to her aunt. So we're getting these themes repeated quite a lot. We have a syndeton with vidit desperavit, so she saw and she despaired. And actually Pliny uses a syndeton when he talked about all the ways that his wife enjoys his writing. Oh, she reads it, she learns it by heart, she loves it. But here it's a more dire situation. Vidit desperavit hortata est. And again, we could say it's a tricolon. We've got 3. She saw, she despaired, she encouraged him to die. Shift as she takes the lead. Yeah, so comes, dux. So she goes from a companion, a comes, to a dux, to a leader. And it's a really swift decision. So ligavit, she leapt. So There are a few things that emphasise the loyalty of the wife, the peril of the situation, and the pace of the story. You know, Pliny is quite a good storyteller, to be fair. And we see this reflected in some of the images that you might be asked about in the exam as well. I really encourage you to look at the Pliny videos side by side, because there are parts of the language that are kind of his idiolect, they're particular to how he speaks. So I'm thinking about the asyndeton he uses when he describes what the wives do. Some of the traditional vocabulary, like pietas came up in his other letter, fidelius, like more loyal. He's emphasising really similar themes about marriage and the role of a wife across the two letters, but just in different ways. If we look at some of the artwork that you could be asked about on the exam, it's on a really similar theme to what Pliny's talking about. And it's dedicated, so everything you see here is dative. Fidelissimae, amantissimae, pientissimae, to his most faithful, most loving, and most devoted. And we know that it's woman because they're all feminine, dative, superlative, because we've got issim, got a feminine ending, we've got a dative ending. And this is dedicated to a wife. If you have a look, this is a cremation chest. So it is similar to the epitaphs that we've read when we looked at like the epitaph to Claudia. So she's quite, I mean, is she young? She's 27. I'm not saying that's not young, but for the time, it's like fairly young. Her husband was likely older. Obviously, it's usually the case. But we see them getting married. So actually, the marriage is so important in a woman's life. You know, often it features on the way that she's remembered. Like it is a defining moment in her life. And we remember from the epitaph to Claudia that her role as a mother is commemorated as well. So, you know, whether we're comfortable with that or not, a woman's role as a wife and mother would be almost definitive in the way that they're commemorated by the men in their lives. And remember, the men would be paying for all this stuff. Like they're going to decide how their wife is remembered. So we can see two burning torches either side of the marriage ceremony, and this is a reference to what would be happening at a wedding. So if you've translated any stories about Roman weddings, you'll know that they carried torches in the procession. And it's invoking the goddess of fertility, Ceres. But we don't really have any clues about, that I can see anyway, about, you know, whether this couple had a family. What you'll see if you start to compare the image sources is the way that fidelity is idealised in artwork. So the women are shown on their tombstones in a marriage ceremony. Even in the image of Penelope that we've looked at, which is a later image, it's medieval, the example of Penelope as the loyal wife in myth is referred to in Ovid, it's referred to in Martial's epigram when we know that the lady changes from Penelope to Helen. And so the way that loyalty and fidelity and the role of wives is talked about is a really, really repeated theme that I would encourage you to find a practice 15 marker on, plan a practice 15 marker on, because there's a good chance that something like that could come up. I hope that was really helpful for you. I'll link any helpful resources I can find in the comments below, and best of luck with your revision.